We're good to go. All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Cox. I'm the BC investigative reporter for the Narwhal, and we're excited to dive deeper into the topic of BC's old growth, which the Narwhal has been reporting on for a few years now. We're going to wait a few more minutes for everybody to join us. And while we're waiting, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Narwhal in case you aren't familiar with us. We're a nonprofit digital publication that launched just over 3 years ago. And our team of reporters tells in-depth stories about the natural world that you won't read anywhere else in Canada. Just last week, our team was extremely honored to be given gold for general excellence from the Digital Publishing Awards. And you might have heard already today, but we have some pretty big news. We're getting ready to bring our one-of-a-kind journalism to Ontario. Before we do, we hope to start building those important connections to our new readers there, and we're asking for your help. We need to spread the word to any and all of your Ontario pals to get them hooked up with the Narwhal's newsletter. And we've got a pretty awesome perk for you. We'll send along a free tote bag to anyone who gets 3 of their friends to subscribe. So check your email today for the Narwhal's newsletter, which should have landed in your inbox about an hour ago for all the details. And if you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, we're going to drop a link in the chat to our Ontario email sign up page. So please pass that around. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that I work and live on the land of the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose territories the city of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and West Saanich peoples whose relationship with the land continues to this day. A few housekeeping notes before I introduce you to our very exciting guest. We're providing closed captioning, and to turn it on, go to your control panel at the bottom of your screen and select the arrow next to closed captioning to turn it on. You can also select caption settings to control the size of the captions, and you can move the caption box anywhere around your screen. The session is being recorded and will be available to view online in the coming days. A recording of the chat will also be made available to everyone who registered for this event. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can today. And feel free to provide us feedback on today's event at editor@thenarwhal.ca. Our guest today is Garry Merkel. Garry is a registered professional forester from the Tahltan Nation. He was also the co-chair of BC's Old Growth Strategic Review Panel. And he was just telling us before the webinar started that he's just received an honorary doctorate from the University of British Columbia. Garry, we've spoken on the phone a few times over the last year. It's very nice to meet you in person, to see you in person virtually, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm curious to know why you became a forester. What was it that drew you to this field?
Like most of my life, I'll tell you a little story. I was in Ottawa working, just serendipitous, I ended up building forest cover maps in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. That's where you look at these photos and you draw lines around the different kinds of forests and end up with a map. And one of the fellows who worked there said, you know what? I was from the North. He said, if somebody like you, if you went to school for 2 years, you could become an RMO, a resource management officer, because they really want Northern people to come and look after Northern land. And if you were in that job, you get to look after the land over a huge area. And there's like 4 of them in the Yukon. So you'd be looking after a quarter of the Yukon. And I just thought, oh my God, that just like, I can't even imagine a better dream. So I did go to school. I never ended up being an RMO, but I ended up being this. So I guess that's close enough. Yeah.
Wow.
Because I love it. Yeah. Simple answer.
So 2 years ago, you and Forester Al Gorley were tasked with the job of heading an Old Growth Strategic Review Panel. Can you tell us a bit about that panel and what kind of work went into the review, and what did you discover in your time on the panel?
Sure. Al and I, well, we were, I don't want to say that we didn't want to do it, but like most people, we're very, very busy, and Al's trying to be busy getting retired, but it's not working super well for him. And so we came into this, I don't want to say reluctantly, but it was a bit of a cajoling, I think, for both of us to be convinced that we could do it just because we were both busy with things. But once we decided, the reason I decided ultimately was because I really like Al and I respect Al, and it turns out that he had the same idea. And we did think that we had something to say about this. Both of us have been in all parts of the sector forever, and have worked with tons of public and different things and public policy. So our job, him and I were the panel, and it was really to go out and talk to British Columbia and come back with a new way to manage old growth in the province of British Columbia. In particular, a more science-based and frankly land-based approach to managing old growth. But the thing, as we went through it and as we went around the province and talked to everybody, and as we understood the issue better, it became clear to us that old growth is certainly a hot topic, and it's an important component of the land base. But it really became obvious and apparent to us is we really need to understand why we're doing it and the larger picture and how that fits into it to actually look after it properly. So our review ended up being much bigger than just looking at the old growth component. We really need to make some major systemic changes in order to properly look after our ecosystems and the old growth in them in this province.
And in terms of some of the main things that you came up with, there's recommendations about ecosystem-based management and about biodiversity protection. Can you just maybe highlight a few of those?
Yeah, I will. Maybe I'll start with the answer to that by speaking about our first observation was that in order to make any of these changes, we first have to go through a paradigm shift. We need to shift the way that we think about forests in this province in British Columbia. And this is a shift that many countries before us have had to do, and many are struggling with going through. Our current paradigm is that we manage our forests for timber subject to constraints and ecosystem health, wildlife, biodiversity risk, visual quality, and a number of others. They're constraints. And we are allowed to manage for all those other values, but in many areas, the cumulative impact of managing for all of those other values can't have an impact of more than 10% on the annual allowable cut of timber. So what we're managing for is timber and trying to take care of everything else that we can as constraints up to a limit. That has to change. Ultimately, our view was that has to change. And we need to start to think about managing for ecosystem health, because if we don't look after the land, our basic philosophy and the philosophy we heard from right across this province, if we don't look after the land, nothing else really matters, because it will not look after us. It can't look after us anymore. You have to look after yourself by looking after the land. We advocated for ecosystem management, and I'll explain that in the most common sense kind of terms that I can. Ecosystems exist at small levels, like when you go into a forest. I have a cottonwood old growth stand across from me here in the marshland. That forest is about 250 years, and it's got its own little ecosystem in there. It's got a bunch of plants and animals and biota and fungi and moss and air and water and in our culture, spirits that are all connected together and support each other as an ecosystem, like your body, I guess, kidneys, heart, blood, etc. And then that is at one level. And then at another level, ecosystems exist at a landscape. So this particular ecosystem supports all of these animals and functions that are important because they connect to the other ones on a landscape, and the connection between them and the movement of things between them all keep the landscape healthy. That's ecosystem health at a local level and at a bigger level. Turns out when you manage for ecosystem health, the old forest component of ecosystems are an absolutely essential element to keeping ecosystems healthy at a landscape level. And it's not just how much you have to have a certain amount. In fact, the formula is if you have at least 70% of the ecosystems that normally existed in a landscape, if they're still there, healthy and functioning, you will likely have very little impact on biodiversity. What that means is you will lose very few species. You'll have very little impact likely on water functioning, almost negligible. But once you start going below 70%, you start to have impacts. Until if you get down to 30% of what the old growth was existing on a landscape, and not just patches of it, connected and all different types across a landscape, if you get down below 30%, you are in a very high biodiversity risk situation. That means that you're going to start to lose a lot of minor species. You're going to definitely lose a few major species, moose, caribou, goats, sheep, all those types of things. You are going to compromise water functioning most likely. You're going to compromise local climates and a whole bunch of other things. Your ecosystems start to become unhealthy as naturally functioning ecosystems. And so we manage how much we keep on a landscape. Then we try to make sure that we have all types and they're connected to each other. And then each of those needs to be big enough so that the interior of them can keep functioning. Because when you build a road through one of these things, the impact of the road causes the edges of that road or an adjacent block up to 200 meters into a stand can be affected and not function the same as it is. So they also have to be big enough. When we manage for ecosystem, we manage that stuff across a landscape. But we also do one more important thing, and then I'll stop on this one. We also, when we take trees or when we harvest these, and the silviculture systems that we use, as much as possible to keep the landscape functioning and healthy, need to mimic as closely as possible the disturbance patterns that would normally exist in nature. On the coast, you see nature creates very few large openings and takes everything. It creates small openings and trees fall over here and there. So the kinds of systems we'd use there would be more long selection over a broad area. So you can almost not tell that things are taken. And you'd probably do that once every few hundred years through each area. Where we have fires, you look at an area after a fire, it is rarely cleared completely, although a few areas are. There's islands and things, there's stuff left over. So when we take trees out and harvest them in fire areas, we want it to kind of look like that when it's left. And if you can manage like that and keep the old growth, your ecosystems will generally stay healthy and they'll take care of all of the things inside of it. That's the simple non-science version, I guess.
So, and old growth has become such a heated issue in BC right now, with so little of it left. Less than 3%, according to independent scientists, is left of the biggest trees, the most productive old growth valleys. What, in the midst of the heatedness of this issue, what do you think has been oversimplified about it?
Well, there's been a number of things that have been oversimplified. I think one of the things that we fooled ourselves with for a fairly long time now, we've thought that old growth is a renewable resource. And in some areas that might be true. But even, I'll just pick this cottonwood ecosystem across from me again. It's only, the trees rarely get over 250 years old. because they get too full of water and they rot and they fall over. But they're monstrous trees and they suck up thousands of gallons of water every day, and they keep the whole area from not turning into an underwater swamp. And they keep a very big complex of things going. If you clear that completely and don't leave anything left, what happens is the water table comes up and it takes forever for anything to reestablish again. And then once it reestablishes, it has to go through this really long cycle of things growing up and dying until it finally, eventually, in this ecosystem, could take 1,000 years for it to come back to look like that again, even though the trees are only 250 years old. On the coast, some of those ecosystems have taken a few thousand years, like 10, 20,000 years, they say, for some of them to develop into what they are. The trees aren't that old, but it's the ecosystem that's the important part. There's so many functions and species and things that we don't even know about that are in there. And we think this is a renewable resource. So we have this idea that if you cut it down and clear cut it and take everything out and all the structure and all the biomass and completely leave it way back, you move it back at a minimum quite a few hundred years, and in some cases a few thousand years, the chance of that ever coming back into the same kind of thing is almost zero. Around Vancouver and a few of the richer places down there and on the island, you can grow some pretty big trees in a short time, 80 to 100 or maybe 150 years, but you cannot grow that ecosystem again. And in many areas, those trees won't grow without that ecosystem there. So that is kind of a very much an oversimplification that we have lived with in my mind for a long time. The second thing is this is all about protect or not protect. And sorry, I had a mosquito just trying to eat me. We live out in the woods. And that thinking, I know why we do it now, but the thing is, in my culture, the land is meant to be used. The question is how. And because we're doing from what a lot of people consider such a poor job at how, we think it's all about protect or not protect, which takes us away from thinking about what's right for that land. It's either don't use it or use it lots. And that for me, that dummies down management, and it way oversimplifies it, and it doesn't think about the land and look after it properly. In fact, it results in very poor management systems, unfortunately, in my perspective, in many cases.
And Garry, in the middle of this new war in the woods, is there a question about old growth and a question about this issue that is not being asked?
I want to speak again about this paradigm shift, because I think a lot of people don't really understand it, and we're using it like a weapon, a weapon word. And so, yes, there is the question is what is that and how do we do it? A paradigm shift, a paradigm is the way you think. It's the whole way you think together. A paradigm shift is changing pretty much your whole way of thinking and moving it over. And for us to make the kind of changes we have to make, we've grown up in a culture, a timber culture in British Columbia now for almost 200 years, and that's who we are. It's a deep, deep part of this society, and we have to figure out how to move from that thinking over to this new thinking. And I know a lot of people say, well, poof, I've got a magic wand. I can just make you think by tapping you on the head and you'll be smart. Or I just have to say it to you and you'll know it. It doesn't work like that. I mean, if it worked like that, then everybody would be perfectly skinny and completely fit and not smoke and not drink, because all you got to do is say it and you can do it. It doesn't work like that. You have to change your thinking so that you can change your behavior. Changing thinking is a big job at a societal level. It's quite a complex process, but it actually boils down to some very simple pieces, very, very simple pieces. And I may talk about those in a bit, but for now, I think that's one of the bigger questions that we're not getting to. We think this is an oversimplified yes/no question when it's not. This is a societal shift question. And that's where we need to put our minds to.
And if you were in charge of the province, what are the first things you would do right now, today, tomorrow, to begin to resolve the conflict around this issue?
Well, first off, I would help make us all understand, and I don't know how to, I have ideas about how to do this, but the first thing we all need to understand is that this is not going to happen overnight, and it needs all of us to work together to do it. So the first thing we need to do, as I said, is we need to shift our societal thinking. We need a major paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift, I've been involved in helping make societal paradigm shifts a couple times now on some fairly big things. And it involves three, this is the way I do it. You know, maybe other people have different ways. This is the way I do it. The first big piece is you have to build understanding of the new paradigm. In other words, we need to learn as a province what ecosystems are about and how they function and how we start to live with them and look after them, how we can do multiple things in them without impacting, and that type of thing. We make it our whole being to know about those. We teach it in schools. We have tours. We involve people in planning. We do all of that. The second thing, and the second part that we actually, I didn't forget to mention, but I will mention now, is our view is that we have to move to this style of management, but we also need to ground the management into the people and the public properly in an informed way, supported by the proper science and the proper ecologists and environmentalists and indigenous knowledge and et cetera. Because right now we're victims of our own political system. We're managing thousands of year-old ecosystems on a 4-year political cycle. And so every party that comes in has a different ideology, and we've seen some radical swings in this province, and we may see some in the future where everyone has a different idea. And that grounding, it just never, it tends to lose its memory, and it tends to change its mind a lot. And we believe we need a stronger rudder. We believe that is people who live in an area who are educated and informed. Second thing, that's when I say the second area is to build structures that reflect this thinking and organizations and processes, so that as we live it, and as we live this notion of managing and looking after ecosystems from a collective wisdom point of view, we built the appropriate structures. So that's just the way we start to do business. And then finally, we celebrate it. When you try to make major changes in thinking, it's really hard sometimes to see the progress. It's hard to see it in reality. And so you have to stop every now and again and just say, wow, we've come a long ways, and we need to celebrate our progress. We need to promote art about it and culture about it, and come together and have opportunities to share our experience about it in a more celebratory way. So building understanding, building appropriate organizations and systems that support that new way of thinking, and celebrating it, all together over time result in a change in societal thinking. At least that's the way I have done it myself in the places that I've done it. And I would take that type of approach, a much more inclusive and reporting back and involving people, because you're going to make mistakes. This is a big job. This is and if we just leave it up to some people, it makes it too easy. We just beat them up if a mistake happens. If we're doing it together, we have to figure it out together to solve it, and it makes it a lot more real but harder. Maybe that's all. I got a lot more to say, but I'll stop there. That's enough, Brandon. Yeah.
And Garry, I just have one more question for you, and then we'll turn to some of the questions that people are sending in, and thanks for sending those. You recently told the Narwhal that BC can expect to see a lot more Fairy Creek style confrontations. Why do you think that we are set up for that?
I said I'm not surprised, and yes, it's true. We will likely see more of these. The reason being is that our timber industry right now is still very dependent. Our timber industry is still very dependent on the old growth portion of the profile in many areas. It's true that a lot of companies have started to cut second and even third growth on the coast. But in terms of the economy and the way the timber industry has developed, almost every part of the industry depends on some component of old growth to remain viable. To stop that overnight would have major catastrophic effects on the industry. And frankly, transforming to different practices and planning properly, we can probably minimize the pain through the transition, but there is going to be some transition issues because there are many areas in the province where we are up against the edge. We have gone well below those biodiversity thresholds and we are at high risk. And if we start to shift over to ecosystem management, we're going to start to see, that is going to take a little bit of time to move into that management. But there are only so many of these kind of iconic areas left. There's actually, compared to even 10 years ago, there's less, a lot less. And certainly there was an old growth review 25 years ago, done 25 years ago. And if we had have done the recommendation to that one, we wouldn't be in this situation. But in that 25 years, we have lost so many of those closer iconic ones that people feel near and dear to. And we heard about those across this province, people telling us about their near and dear places that were potentially up for logging. And that's why I say I'm not surprised about Fairy Creek. And I expect a few more because there's just so few of them left. And then a lot of them are close to people's hearts. And so you could just expect this to happen.
So that leads into a question from a reader. And the question is, how can the public convince the BC NDP government to fulfill their promise to implement the Old Growth Strategic Review Panel's recommendations in their entirety, including a commitment to work with First Nations to immediately halt logging in the most at-risk old growth forests?
My answer to that is that actually the government is doing that. And I personally, I know it's easy to be skeptical of government, and I appreciate why that is. But everything I have seen tells me that the government is doing its darndest to implement this thing in its entirety. It has to take off. I'll characterize it as bite-sized chunks. We are changing an entire sector that's at the core of our province in quite a radical way. The discussions with the Indigenous community are proceeding, and the partnerships are being built around stewardship. The deferral areas, I understand, are very close across the province of being identified and worked through First Nations. And so I do think that the province has implemented this slower than what we had thought could be possible when we wrote the report. But I do caution that we wrote that report. We put out some timelines, and our timeline said, essentially, you need to be started in earnest on these tasks within this time. And the earliest ones were like 6 months. We submitted that report. We finished it right when COVID came. And we had no idea what the impacts of COVID would have been. And by necessity, this is an initiative that requires engagement and deep engagement of a wide number of people to do properly. It's just not like a magic poof, you can do it. You are changing an entire sector here. And without that ability to get out and build the interdisciplinary planning tables that we spoke about and formalize a provincial approach and strategy, government has had to compensate by reaching out to as many people as it can through its channels and learn how to work virtually while it's trying to implement DRIPA at the same time and build all the Indigenous relationships. And that has turned out to be a task that I think nobody could have anticipated how much it impacted us in this. My personal feeling, I'm nonpartisan. I belong to the Groucho Marx party. In other words, I don't belong to any party that would have me. And I don't think any party could have done any better in the circumstances that we're doing now. But I do not, at this point, question the intent and the commitment to the cause. I may at some point if something changes, but at this point, I don't.
Thank you. We have another question from a reader. And the question is, would you advise that a key action needed to preserve more old growth in BC would be to encourage the Premier to take back more of the forest land base from the companies that have the rights to it? And should this land be redistributed back to First Nations?
That's an interesting question. There's two dimensions. Well, there's multiple dimensions to that question. I feel like I'm sidetracking a little bit here, but I just really want to speak to our tenure system and our stumpage system for 2 seconds. We couldn't address those because they were a bit outside of the scope of what we did. But our tenure system is designed to allocate every stick of available timber in the province. And we know that we can't get at every stick that we theoretically calculate because there's so many things we run into and so many things happen. So what it tends to do over time is it tends to over allocate. And then because of unexpected circumstances and soft constraints that turn into hard constraints and et cetera. And so then every company is required to cut fully everything it's allocated. So we end up pushing ourselves further into a corner because we're taking more than what we theoretically could in a sustainable way. That creates a real problem in terms of trying to just say, okay, we're going to just completely reallocate. We're just going to take all this back now. These are legal contracts. And so, yeah, we can take them back. There is an estimate. I know I saw some provincial estimates of how much it would cost. It's well into the billions, quite a few billions for us to do that. And they are legal contracts. The government can't break them or they'll go to court and they'll have to pay it anyways. So I guess we could if we're willing to pay that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't or we should. I'm just saying it's possible, but there is a big cost to that. And that cost generally translates into reduced healthcare, education, roads, or whatever. So, I know I missed part of the question, but that really is, it could happen, but it's costly to do it like that. Now, the First Nations part, yes, that's the other part, or the Indigenous groups. That's a whole other political conversation. I happen to believe in my heart of hearts, and this is not just because I am Indigenous, but I believe that the Indigenous community has a lot to teach us about how to look after land properly. And everywhere where Al and I went, where the Indigenous group had really started to articulate its land values and learn how to translate those into management systems that made sense for them. And they were looking after the way that they would look after land from their cultural roots. We saw I thought, much superior approaches to management than we've seen traditionally practiced in this province. And I think there is a lot of hope in that. I really have to feel that as those groups get better and better at doing this. But there is going to be some pain moving through that transition too, because not everybody's at the same level.
So picking up on that question, we have a question from webinar participant Serena Renner. And the question is, what are the best examples we can turn to in BC of ecosystem-based management, high retention harvesting? Is any community or region doing this well?
We have a lot that are starting. And there is good things to learn from each of these. One of the, I'm not making excuses here, but one of the realities of this kind of management is that you could first, just changing over and building a plan to do it takes a while because you have to learn so much about the land and about everything. So it takes you a few years to actually do a plan, and then retool to implement it takes a little while. It takes a little while to actually do it. And then once you start doing it, it's hard to tell how it's working, because the forest, just because I went out and did things differently for a year doesn't mean the forest is going to change at a landscape level. So it's hard to tell until you've done it for at least a couple, 3, 4, 5 decades before you can really start to see if it's working properly at that scale. But we do have, some of the LRMPs, we saw the Okanagan, a few others where the land and resource management planning tables, where they still had the table together. They were still trying to adhere to some of the original objectives, and we're really trying to stay true to ecosystem management principles. They seem to work. The Great Bear Rainforest is one, but I understand there's a lot of implementation issues in that. We really didn't study that one closely. We did see a couple First Nations ones. One in particular I want to speak about, but I won't mention names because they haven't given us permission to. They might be okay with it, but I can't do it unless I ask them. Is they've adopted an approach where on their landscape where they're working, their elders have said to them, you need to keep at least 50% of the landscape in old forest. And then you can intensively manage the rest of the landscape, but you must do it in a way that is similar to the way nature would do it. So you need to kind of mimic nature's disturbance patterns. And so they work with the elders to lay out all the areas, thinking about where the animals move and how things need to be connected and stuff. And those older areas can move around on the landscape. As things grow up, you can take maybe one of them and move another one into the pool. And based on their initial calculations, they think that the number of trees that they're going to be able to take off that particular piece of land is going to be higher than what they could have under the old system, where they were basically clear cutting on a systematic basis and planting behind themselves. They're pretty confident they're going to get at least as high, if not a higher annual allowable cut out of this area. But they are going to preserve all the wildlife habitat and integrity, preserve the biodiversity, keep the ecosystem healthy at a local and a landscape level, and preserve all of the water functioning, which the cities around them are super, super happy about, because we heard a lot of horror stories about water systems being affected by the other kind of management in this province, and they were super happy about that. So yes, there's glimmers of hope. I would love to have somebody or do a project to go out there and say, we're part of our recommendations were in fact to actually start to learn from all of these models and examples and think about if and how we can apply them in different areas and teach all of the areas, the local planning tables, about these approaches, and start to work on figuring out how to adapt and adopt these in different areas. I want to emphasize this again. This is not a simple yes/no thing. This is a transition, and it requires collective wisdom and collective commitment to do it properly. If we just think government's going to do it, government can have the political will and push it as far as it can, but ultimately it has to be grounded in people, and it has to use collective wisdom for it to last. That was our view anyways. We could be wrong. It's only two old guys saying what they know. Yeah.
Two very wise old guys. We have a question from Tony Pierce, saying that you've called for a paradigm shift in thinking about forests, and more specifically for BC to enact an overarching biodiversity law to prioritize ecosystem integrity and conservation across all sectors. And he says, but your review and all other independent reviewers, as far as I can tell, paint a picture of a forest ministry that is incapable of making this shift. What is your evidence to support a belief that such a paradigm shift is possible within the forest ministry?
Yeah. Well, first off, maybe I do wear rose-colored glasses, but I've been able to achieve a lot in my life by believing that the glass is half full. In fact, I believe I have achieved a lot more with that orientation than my friends who say the glass is half empty. So that's a general comment. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my friends who can just beat people into it have done more than I have. I don't know. But for me, the big things that point to me that we are in a different situation, and again, I could be wrong, this is just me, is we heard universally across every sector, including the industrial forest sector, forest dependent communities, the environmental groups, the municipal governments, every sector. I go through the whole list, and First Nations and Indigenous communities. They all said the same thing. The system we're working under now is not working. It's not working for any of us. It's not giving us security on timber supply. It's not giving us stability. It's not looking after the land properly in many cases. It's not allowing the other industries to flourish. And in fact, it's killing some other industries in some places that are really important to the locals there. And we have to change this system. It's nothing but conflict, and we need to move to a new way of managing that's much more sustainable and much more grounded in land. That for me is a strong signal that British Columbia wants to change. And I was personally, Al and I talked about this a few times, at how surprised we were to hear that same message from so many sectors that you wouldn't have thought you would have heard it from, and so many people. Almost without exception, there was the odd exception of the old style person that you heard that says, there's no problem, you guys are full of crap doing this and leave us alone. And I think we might have heard that twice out of the thousands of people that we talk to in every sector. So I'm not saying it's not out there. The second thing that gives me a ton of hope is I know a lot of these political folks personally. You know, we've kind of grown up over the years on related things, and I know many of the people in the bureaucracy, and there is a genuine understanding that we need to change. Like, we really do need to work on fostering this paradigm shift. And I've been talking a lot with them about how do you affect this kind of a paradigm shift at a very large scale. You know, everybody, again, I have to emphasize this. A paradigm shift is a fundamental shift in thinking. It's essentially a revolution in thinking. It's moving from way over here to way over here. And I just think about it in your own life. For those of you who might have a certain religious orientation, change your religion tomorrow and think like that. That's what a paradigm shift is. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work to help people work through that. Government is working to understand that now, and we've been talking a lot and thinking about, okay, well, how do we make that happen inside government and outside of government? Because there is a process to go through, and we're understanding that. I don't know. I have to be optimistic. If I wasn't optimistic, I wouldn't have done this work in the first place, because, you know, I got things to do. I'm busy, frankly. So I have to be.
And we have a related question from Ruth Waldick, saying that one of the biggest hurdles to shifting the existing paradigm is the urgency or time pressure that is not just political in origin, but also derives from financial needs. And she asks, yes, what do you think could be used to manage or finance this interim period so that the logging does not just continue while these conversations are underway?
There is, you know, I need to preface this conversation that I'm not an expert at the tools that government has available, but I do know that for the deferrals in particular, they can have deferrals up to a certain period without penalties, unless the people have already gone so far into the planning and development that they've sunk a lot of costs that aren't recoverable. Then government will have to come in and have to work out some kind of compensation or other arrangements or something. We can, in many cases, ideally be able to move harvest around for a while. And particularly on these extremely sensitive areas, the iconic and the ecosystems at risk where we are down to almost no representation left in them anymore, the old ancients and that type of thing. But at some point, my gut tells me that this is going to, the way we do, this is a bit of an aside, but it's a small technical thing, but I think it's important for people to understand. The way our annual allowable cut works in this province is we have calculated the theoretical amount that we can harvest in the province, and it drops down to what we call the long-term sustained yield or the long-run sustained yield or whatever. There's a few different terms that people use for it, but it is in theory the amount that the forest can grow forever in a second growth rotation process. But we have all this old stuff. And what we've done is this old stuff lets us harvest at a higher level. And we've calculated a period of time that we want to draw this pool of old stuff down until we get to this long-term sustained yield. And it's called the drawdown. We could speed that drawdown up and reallocate. But, you know, for me, there's a huge one that we never talk about, and that is, let's start looking at changing our practices. If you harvest in a way that mimics the natural disturbance types, and you leave areas in a very similar structure as to what you when you came in, they look very similar and function very similar as to what they did when you leave, then what happens is your impacts are way less. One of the big problems we have right now is our huge over-reliance and overuse of clear cut and or variant of clear cut, which is not the way that nature typically works, even in fire maintained or fire ecosystems. And that could be certainly a way if we change our practices. And one of our recommendations is let's do that. And we have a whole way of doing it laid out there.
Yeah, a question from a question from Nancy Powell. Do you think that Fairy Creek could become an Indigenous protected area with an agreement like the one we have in the Great Bear Rainforest? And there's also a related question from Robert Walker asking, noting that there are some Indigenous conservation areas in BC and asking if this is a good model for sustainability.
Well, I'm familiar with IPCA's Indigenous Protected and Conservation Areas. It's a federal initiative. They're funding to get Indigenous groups to identify and designate a bunch of these. First off, the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction in this. So what they're doing is they're supporting Indigenous groups to identify areas and work with other governments to work on ways to potentially designate them. But it's not a guarantee that they will happen. Each Indigenous group has a different thought about land. Where I come from, I'm actually leading our land stewardship planning work, and we see it like this. Where I come from, and many other Indigenous groups are the same. The land is meant to be used. It's how you use it that is the question. And one of my good friends says, the reason we create parks is because we don't trust ourselves to look after land. And he's right. He is totally right about that. And so in our view, if you build a stewardship plan that speaks about how to properly manage for ecosystem health, maintain critical habitat requirements for the major like habitat migration corridors and stuff for major species, you may have to factor a bit of that in, but making sure that you're taking care of both the aquatic, the water ecosystems, and the terrestrial, the land ecosystems. If you're keeping those healthy, they keep everything else healthy. you stop having to think about every single animal because you're keeping the system healthy. The system will keep the other things healthy. So our stewardship plan speaks to how do you keep the land healthy, and how do we maintain the land's ability to support our life on that land, our living on that land. And then what we say is, if you can prove to us that you can meet those constraints, the constraints that keep the ecosystem healthy and our ability to live on that land, then we will look at your development and we will consider it. So from our perspective, if we build a land use plan or a land stewardship plan that looks like that, then our whole territory is an IPCA, because that's how we would live with it and look after it anyways. In the past, it would be protected, it would be conserved, and it would be there forever, looking after it right.
And along the lines of potential solutions, there's a question from Wendy Palin, and she notes that in the US, when the logging of old growth in the Pacific Northwest hit a political impasse, where there was a perceived conflict between endangered species and timber harvest, the Democratic government approached the issue from a different angle and implemented a roadless protection rule that essentially prevented further old growth harvest in areas that had not previously been logged. She says that these areas are the ones where the ecosystems are most intact and of the highest priority to protect. And she wonders if you think that a similar approach might be worthwhile in British Columbia.
Al and I recommended a system, a three-tiered management system. One was, we have certain areas that are protected for certain key values, and they're probably going to end up being roadless or minor roaded with relatively limited human recreational type use and limited other product use, limited impact use. That's the way I'll say. Of course, you can still use them. The second larger component of the landscape we recommended, we need to manage purely for ecosystem health across a landscape. And then there's some areas where we could potentially intensively manage a bit like tree farms, but we still should, as much as possible, try to tie into the larger ecosystem management. So we have a recommendation very similar to that. It's a little more expansive because, and we saw that was necessary for a whole bunch of reasons. I don't want to go through all of them here today, but yeah, that is part of a solution. I wouldn't say it is the solution, but it is certainly part. You know, I want to go back maybe just for 1 second. The fellow asked about the ecosystem health legislation that we proposed, and I understand Minister Conroy has said that she will table this before cabinet this year. There are many areas in this province where our ecosystem functioning is compromised, not by the forest sector. The forest sector may have played some role in it. It's by urbanization, agriculture, transportation, oil and gas, mining, and even in some cases, recreation have impacted the landscape to the place where some of these ecosystems are compromised now. And forestry, I'm saying, did play a part, and forestry is probably the biggest contributor across the province, but that's why you need a bigger look at it and a more comprehensive look. If we get lost on picking on only the forest sector, we're going to end up finding areas that are going to get compromised because we forgot to deal with the rest of the stuff that impacts the land base.
And there's so many great questions here. I wish we had time for them all. I think we have time for one more question. There's one from Penny Crawford, and she wants to know if you would consider the current war in the woods unnecessary, as you've stated that the government is working through the changes that are required to bring about the paradigm shift.
You know, I don't want to tell people to go out and beat out government, and I don't want to tell people, government to go and beat up these people, or industry to beat up everybody. I think this is the way I see it at a larger scale. I think all of these things are important to help facilitate social change. Social change doesn't happen without a certain amount of pressure and keeping the pressure on. But there is a point where that pressure can get so difficult to manage that it actually paralyzes movement forward. And we end up getting trapped and we don't move. And it's funny because I've seen this happen so many times with governments where they're just getting beat up so badly on so many fronts that they just get absolutely paralyzed and don't know what to do, or industry gets into that place. So yes, all of these things play a role. They're important in the overall thing, but it's just the same as if, let's just say, the industrialists who didn't want to do this got too big and crippled everything else. It can cripple and paralyze if one part of it gets too strong. That's generally what tends to happen. That's what I've seen. But I haven't seen everything in my life. There may be situations where it actually doesn't work like that, but I can't see it. I haven't seen it yet.
Wonderful. And Garry, any final thoughts that you want to leave us with today?
Well, I'm really thankful for everybody to be interested in this subject. For me and for Al, is looking after land is such, without the land, you're done. Like, you have to look after the land, and we believe that this is a process of empowering, educating, and involving everybody. That's how the shift is going to happen. If we try to force it on people, it's not going to work. We're going to continue with this polarized, slow pace that we're working through to change. And I have to be optimistic that we're going to do this. Like I said, I have to, and I'll personally do whatever I can to help advocate that it continues to happen. But Al and I are only one, a couple people. This is our wisdom based on everything we've heard. I don't ever pretend that we were 100% right, because I'm confident that we probably got some things wrong. But the way of thinking that we've approached this with is the way to think about it, as a large systems problem that we need to fix. It's not just a piece of land here or a piece of land here. This is a big shift, and we need to think about it like that to make the proper change.
Garry, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We very much appreciate it. It's time to wrap up now, and we're so sorry we weren't able to get through everybody's great questions. Just a reminder to folks to please pass along that newsletter sign up referral link to all of your Ontario friends and family and contacts. You can check for the link in the chat box. I think it's being dropped in there right now. And just wanted to say again, thank you for your attendance and support for the Narwhal. Goodbye.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.